to
Good morning. We're Team 5, and we're once again made up of faculty from California State University Northridge and California State University Sacramento. I am Dr. Marquita Gamage, and my team members are Dr. Franco Beltrain Silva, Dr. Nelly Duran, Dr. Lynn Tashiro, and Dr. Jasdeep Panu. We also want to acknowledge our team lead, Dr. Allison Nunez. Today's presentation is focused on funding and future faculty diversity. We're going to start off by giving you a little background. So increased discourse has risen in the United States in education regarding the racial diversity of educators. More specifically, much concern has surrounded the racial and ethnic composition of faculty in colleges and universities across the nation, particularly since the 1960s in higher education with the student movement for inclusive curriculum and the establishment of ethnic studies. Research have documented the important contributions of Black, Hispanic, and faculty of color make to college campuses and students' overall academic experiences and achievement. Compelling evidence suggests that Black and Hispanic faculty presence on college campuses is an important predictor for Black and Hispanic student academic success, enrollment, retention, and graduation rates. Within the CSU, campuses and the surrounding communities have lobbied for diversified faculty recruitment and retention practices and policies. At CSUN in 1968, a group of students put together a list of demands in Storm Valley State, demanding the university invest in hiring Black full-time faculty, increase Black student enrollment, and diversifying the curriculum. So where are we now? This leads us to our motivation. Although campus diversity is growing among student populations, higher education has not seen the same growth among college professors. Between 2010 and 2018, Black college student enrollment increased from 31% to 37%, and Hispanic college student enrollment increased from 22% to 36%. Comparatively, in 2018, 75% of the full-time faculty tenured and tenure track at post-secondary institutions were white. Only 6% were Black and another 6% were Hispanic. At CSUN, we are a minority serving institution with an HSI designation, with 50% of our population are Hispanic and Black. That's 56%. Yet only 11% of the faculty are Hispanic and 5% are Black. Comparatively, white students make up about 22% of the student population, while white faculty account for 57% of the full-time tenured and tenure-track faculty. Similar disparities exist at Sacramento State, where Black and Hispanic students make up 41% of the student population, which is the largest, while Black and Hispanic faculty account for only 12% of the full-time faculty. Yet white faculty make up the majority of the tenure track and tenured faculty at 47%, while white students account for only 26% of the student population. Black and Hispanics represent a small minority of US doctoral degree recipients and an even smaller percent of the full-time faculty composition, as we just documented. Funding, however, is believed to aid in doctoral degree completion, especially for underrepresented minority groups. Funding is believed to equal more security, protected time, less distractions, more resources, and a larger network. Lack of funding equals longer time to the degree, higher debt, limited academic employment. And making the path to the PhD even more difficult, studies reveal that Black graduate students incur higher amounts of debt and receive less financial support from their institutions. Given the growing demand for increased racial diversity among US college professors, our study seeks to understand the association between doctoral funding and future faculty diversity. Unsurprisingly, the literature review reveals inequities and opportunities. When we look at our literature review, we see that graduate school costs has been reported as a barrier to earning advanced degrees, and for Black students, inequities persist from undergrad to the doctorate, as they incur higher amounts of student loan debt. Minoritized groups are significantly more likely as well to have dependent children. And student parents are more likely to accumulate higher debt and have an increased risk of not earning a degree. Post-graduation, we see inequalities continue. Black female, Black male, and Hispanic males account for 2% each of the full-time professors, and Hispanic females account for only 1% of full-time professors at degree-granting post-secondary institutions. Studies demonstrate that both Black and Hispanic faculty annual earnings are also significantly lower than white faculty and Asian faculty, but to a lesser degree. This leads us to our research question, who will now turn it over to Jazz to discuss.
Thanks, Marquita. So motivated by the literature review, our research question is if having access to resources in higher education, such as funding, is associated with future academic placement and higher salary. And by future academic placement, we mean academic positions such as full-time faculty, part-time faculty, postdoc, research assistantship, lecturership, and particularly, we wanted to see if there are any patterns that differ for those in the URM groups versus their white counterparts. By URM, we mean underrepresented minorities, which include Blacks and Hispanics. And for our data analysis purposes, we used the data set. We used two data sets. We linked them up. The first one is the survey of earned doctorate in 2015, and the second is survey of doctorate recipients in 2017. And for our analysis purposes, the variables that we used were funding status, level of debt, employment in academia, and earnings. And so we are interested in looking at how the results vary across race and ethnicity, especially focusing on Black and Hispanic people, using white people as their comparison group. So funding status is our input variable, and the way we defined is it's based on self-reported variable from the SED data. So we categorize someone as having funding if they report that their primary source is not personal savings or family savings. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Nellie, who will talk further about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Jazz. So we ground the data with the trends we saw in our analyses that are consistent with the literature. So when we look at who gets funded, white students are more likely to receive funding, Hispanics are less likely to be funded than whites, and Blacks are the least likely to receive funding. When we look at who takes longer to graduate, white students graduate the fastest, Black students have the longest time to degree, and Hispanics take the longest time to degree. For the first two questions, we were able to look at Black and Hispanic groups separately. However, when we looked at who is more likely to acquire debt, we had insufficient data to look at Blacks and Hispanic students separately. And thus we collapsed the two groups into URM, or as I mentioned earlier, underrepresented minority students. And so here we see that white students are less likely to have graduate and undergraduate debt, and URM students are more likely to have graduate and undergraduate debt. And we want to keep these findings in mind as we continue our discussion. And now my colleague Franco will explore in greater detail the consequences of these findings.
You're muted.
I missed to hit the bottom. Sorry.
That's okay, Franco. We've all done it.
So in general, we observe that being unfunded is associated with having lower debt. About 50% of unfunded graduates have some debt, contrasting with about 30% of the funded ones. When we break up this by race and ethnicity, we observe that whites, our comparison group, have the lowest debt. This is despite funding status, and it gets even lower. Debt gets even lower if they are funded. On the contrary, if you are an URM, which we defined as being Black or Hispanic, so we're excluding other groups there, you are more likely to have graduate and undergraduate debt, and this debt turns out to be higher with no funding. Out of these groups, it seems that Black graduates are the most disadvantaged as they have the largest amount of debt. But again, having funding is associated with lower debt. Next, please. Thank you. Funding also seems to have a relevant impact on time to degree. This is true for white people and URMs, but URMs take longer on average. Remember that we define URMs as Hispanics and Blacks for our research purposes. And while Black students have the longest time to degree, they benefit considerably from funding, as this reduces the time to degree, as we can observe in the first two columns. Now, Hispanics are an interesting case. Actually, they take more time to graduate if they are receiving funding, which actually begs the question if graduating early is a good thing for every minority. We're looking forward actually to explore this result, which we were puzzled and we cannot as of yet explain. Next, please. So our core question dwells on whether funding has impact on the decision to get an academic job. That's our main interest. And when looking at aggregate, it seems that unfunded students are about equally likely to enter the professorate as funded students. However, it seems that the story is, and here we see that it's fairly similar. It's a 50-50 almost. But the story is different when we disaggregate by race and ethnicity. Next, please. Thank you. So not surprisingly, funding does seem to impact the entry into professorate for URMs, for Blacks and Hispanics. And as you can notice in the graph, URMs are more likely to join the academia if they are funded. This is also true when considering Black and Hispanic students separately, meaning that funded in Black and Hispanic students are more likely to join the academy than their unfunded peers. The proportion of graduate students that go to the academia from our SDR sample, which includes science, engineering, and medicine, increases with funding. So the proportion of students that go into an academic placement, just to remind, it includes postdocs, and this increases by about 15% points for URMs. We cannot, however, assess if this is a self-selection issue, right? We don't know if funding is what is causing this, or if there could be another reason, another variable that makes an individual less likely to apply to funding, which also is related with being less likely to join an academic job. Next, please. Thank you. So also in line with our findings on the professorate decision in the previous slide, funding does seem to be associated with higher salaries. This is true for all groups. Both Hispanics and Black benefit from funding as their salaries are larger after graduation and more than their white peers, which is our comparison group. For Blacks, getting funding is associated with increasing salary of around $10,000 on average, and same for Hispanics. Whereas for white folks, they also benefit, but less, by around $3,000. Now, this is only a binary variable where not they had funding. So U-metrics data could help us understand better in the future of the impact of the intensity of funding on future salaries. I'll leave word to Lynn.
Thank you, Franco. So in the narrative arc, this feels like the exclamation point. So funding is consequential for URMs. Funding speeds up time to degree, it reduces debt accumulation, it feeds the pipeline to the professoriate, and it increases earnings. So as funding points to positive outcomes, lack of funding has severe negative consequences for URMs. It delays the time to degree, it results in higher debt, it disrupts the pipeline from the PhD to academia, and it impacts earning outcomes. Next slide, please. So there are, of course, a few caveats to our study, is that the SDR limits analysis to doctoral graduates in the fields of science, engineering, and health. The SED, of course, is self-reported information on postgraduate plans, not actual plans, has about a 40% response rate. As mentioned earlier, there's a limitation in defining the funding groups because we use the SED. We did not link to metrics to define the funding groups because we wanted to disaggregate the data, and doing so once we linked to metrics made it possible to identify the participants in the study. Also, we left in international students. So based on the conversation from many of the presentations this morning, we do recognize that There are differences in experiences for international students as well as US citizens. So those are the summary of our caveats, and I'm going to pass this to Nellie to tell us about funding and the pipeline.
Thank you, Lynn. So our discussion supports the notion that funding URM students may increase the likelihood of them going into academia and thus strengthen the pipeline. The CSU system, the California State University system, has a few programs that address the need for diverse faculty. The goal of the California State University Chancellor's Doctoral Incentive Program is to increase the number of faculty with the qualifications, motivation, and skills needed to teach the diverse students of the CSU. The CDIP prepares promising doctoral students for CSU faculty positions by providing financial support, mentorship by CSU faculty, and professional development and grant resources. And it is the largest program of its kind in the US. The California Pre-Doctoral Program is designed to increase the pool of potential California State University faculty by supporting the doctoral aspirations of CSU students who have experienced economic and educational disadvantages. The Sally Casanova Scholars have a unique opportunity to explore and prepare to succeed in doctoral programs. Scholars receive one-on-one guidance provided by faculty members within the CSU and the opportunity to work with faculty from doctoral granting institutions. Another program with similar goals is the McNair Scholars Programs that also prepares CSU students to enter and succeed in graduate school. And now I'd like to welcome back our colleague Marquita, who will provide our closing remarks.
Thank you, Nellie. Our study examined the association between doctoral funding and academic placement. We found that there is an association between doctoral funding and entry into the professorate for Black and Hispanic students. Our findings are consistent with the literature that underrepresented minorities are less likely to receive funding, and more specifically, Black doctoral students take a longer time to the degree, incur higher debt, and are underrepresented in the professorate. Future studies should include data disaggregated by funding type, funding duration, and funding amount. While our study looked at a comparison between the most overrepresented group, white doctoral students, and the most underrepresented groups, Black and Hispanic students, additional studies should explore the funding impact by race and ethnicity, including identification as Native American and Asian American, and Pacific Islander. Overall, big data research is one way we can leverage equity in our university's strategic planning and resource allocations. The CSU and other universities in general must be intentional about supporting underrepresented groups, especially in the doctoral students and potential doctoral students, and must make equity-driven efforts to diversify the faculty composition to more accurately reflect the student populations and more effectively serve Black and Hispanic students. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you know, this was terrific as well. You know, these have been 5 such thoughtful presentations. Deshawn and Deborah and Emily, you must find this very satisfying. You did so much work to get this all set up, and then to see all these different lenses that people have brought in. So here we have another lens, right, which is to look at the role of faculty. You know, how do we affect the pipeline, not just of STEM scientists, but people going into the professoriate? I really like that theoretical framework and the setup that you put in place. You know, this difference in underrepresented minority faculty is not something I think was ever known before, right? So that is, I am not aware of any literature that deals with that. What I thought was interesting, and of course you always want to go to more research, is going back to the storyline that I was talking about in the UTSA presentation. To the extent that what funding is doing is building academic skills through the transmission of tacit knowledge, that story where underrepresented minorities, the role of funding in providing that the way in which knowledge is transmitted is a potentially is a pathway that could be studied, right? Because what you really want to understand there is not, well, underrepresented minorities are different in some way. There has to be some structural reason that we would want to think about. And the role of funding is basically, one role possibility is the debt role that you pointed to, but then the other role is the transmission of academic skills. You do point out, obviously, the selection bias issues, which I thought was an important one. But one way of unpacking that, of course, is finding out something about the nature of that funding. Now, you're using the question on the SED that asks what kind of funding they have, but you don't know anything about whether it's federal or non-federal. Being able to find out whether the funding, particularly if it's research funding, whether the PI or the dissertation advisor was of the same sex or race or ethnicity as the graduate student would be really important. I mean, in the work that I've seen, and some of which I've done, having for a woman PhD student to have a woman PI or dissertation advisor makes a big difference. And I'd be very curious to understand if that was the factor that was at play, because then there are obvious policy implications, right? Because what you're always looking for with data is not just to find out a set of facts, but to find out something that provides a policy lever. And you went to that when you were talking about these scholars and the approaches that were being taken. Those are directly related policy storylines. I do have one question. You were the only group that used the survey of doctoral recipients. So I know the question that Wan Ying wanted asked is, did you use the SDR weights? Because in order to be able to do inference, you need to adjust for the fact that the SDR is a sample, not the census like the SED. So when you adjust for the weighting and response rates, your results might be a little bit different. But this is, again, such thoughtful and interesting work from a very different lens. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues, Deborah, Emily, Jason, and Jashawn. Who wants to go first? Jason.
Well, I'm always willing to jump in until people tell me to shut up, or hand me a donut, honestly. Lovely stuff. I should flag that we are actually, Mariah is leading this charge, and Ekaterina is a big part of it, and so is Rokshan. We're about to start doing a direct pilot test of a link from UMetrics to SDR. So still the concerns with UMetrics about coverage, but once we figure out how to do that as we bring in more data, the linkages can move forward more and more easily. I think more importantly, I was with Julia. I really like the frame of sort of how do we see graduate school experience and systematic differences across groups rolling through into the demography of the professorate. Right? I think there are a couple of fun questions you could ask, not with these data, but to think about. Right, there's a historical lag in transitions in the professorate. So fields that are feminizing, for instance, takes a long time for the full professors to become sort of parity across gender, even as graduate students or assistant professors or full professors are. So questions about how you could speed that process. I think the other thing that's really interesting that Julia suggested is thinking hard about the mechanisms that funding carries with it, right? So, the sociologist in me, there are 3 or 4 that you might be able to tease out in different ways. So one is more money is better than less, right? If you're not having to work as a barista, you can spend more time on your research, right? One is, as Julia suggested, skills and knowledge that you can only sort of get through apprenticeship by hand. Another is social capital, right? The relationships you develop and the networks you develop through active research, which may position you to move into academia more strongly, especially given, say, the importance of recommendation letters. This is suggested by Julia's question about PI relationships. But there are also cultural and identity issues. So at least in some studies we've done about undergraduate research experience in other places, one of the big challenges is simply coming to identify oneself as a potential professional scientist, right? And it's hard to do that in a classroom in some ways. It's easier to do it by doing the work. And part of that is putting you in contact, again, the networks, with, for instance, graduate students. Now, obviously, if you're the only person, the only female on an all-male team, for instance, right, you're not going to have quite the same experience. A reason to diversify the faculty. There's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but one of the really interesting questions is if you were going to go from this to intervention, right, it's entirely possible that different sorts of funding would result in maximizing different mechanisms. So fellowship funding versus training grant funding versus grant funding, versus teaching assistantship funding. And I think thinking those things through gets you to policy interventions in ways that other things, it is certainly true, and you've shown it very nicely, that more funding is probably better, right? But often a policy of more is not the easiest one to convince people to implement.
Yeah.
Right.
So fantastic,
anyway, lovely stuff.
Jason.
I'm rambling, so you can probably tell there's a lot going on, but
yeah,
I'll stop.
But just to concretize it, if it's a transmission of skills, then you want to have research funding that funds teams of people with a PI, not just individual fellowships.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So that
I think there's a lot to unpack there in that, Julie, because I do think part of their piece was access to opportunity. You can't transfer academic skills if you don't have the resources or access to them in the first place.
And there's a lot to unpack.
What Marquita did a great job of in the beginning was really making the strong case for the research and pointing out the disparate representation. If 5% of faculty are Black and 11% are Hispanic, just at CSUN, you're probably not going to have your role model be that faculty member of color.
That's
so then
the point.
It does
That's
perpetuate.
right.
It cannot just be on the faculty of color to do the kind of work to strengthen the pathway and the pipeline. And that's why resources are so core, not just for the faculty member, but for students to be able to get exposed to that research. I think it was a really strong case that you made for the research. And I so appreciate that you put that analysis to action in a very concrete way by giving those examples. Very intriguing to go down the path of, I think it was Professor Beltran Silva who talked about more time to graduate, even with funding for Hispanics, and not the case for Blacks. I think that is something that really is worth exploring a little bit more deeply, given some of what we know about the characteristics and the ways that we pay for college and go to college. That's, I think, will be strong for the field. Also intrigued by when you were talking about debt, the things we know about Latinos and Black students in undergraduate level, where there was such a variance in the willingness to take out debt, right? Our Black students are much more likely to have debt in undergraduate than Latino students are. We're much more debt averse, and how that might flip at the graduate level, because we're less likely to get the graduate assistantships and the access to those research support can really turn that on its head. And since you were looking at aggregated debt, there might be an opportunity to unpack that a little bit more. And you can get some of those data in the sources you have. So I think you put a really strong structure together. I can't help but think that with the colleagues at UTSA and what the CSU did, you looked at institutional efforts and potential and defining serving and efforts, and then the pathways and the resources that might get you there together. That sounds like a really strong way of greater awareness and making the case, not just for understanding, but for action.
That's exactly right. You said it so much better than I did. So, Emily, Deshawn.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to say thank you to the CSUN and Sac State team. I sat in on a few of your working sessions as a fly on the wall, so it was really great to see this come together in the way that it did. And just to echo a lot of Deborah's sentiments, particularly taking the lens of faculty representation for your group and your findings, I think is so it's so important, and it speaks to not just the experiences of the faculty, but also students at whatever, undergrad or graduate levels, seeing themselves reflected in faculty. As Deborah mentioned, that mentorship value is important. So thanks so much.
Yeah, I actually appreciate just the lens and the approach you took. I think after sitting through a number of these, the focus tends to always stop at students, right? And the mentoring to the workforce, never going the extra mile to talk about the role of faculty. And that's often something that is pushed, right? Or should I even say highlighted at HBCUs and HSIs, right? Is the ability to actually encounter faculty that look like the students that they're serving. So even to mention that and to bring that up, I think I thoroughly enjoy and believe more research needs to be done on that aspect. And of course, I think Deborah mentioned something about this earlier. But when it comes to like debt level, time to degree, I would really, and this is just in general, right? I would love to see more qualitative research on that, right? Like why? We know like the time frame and what's going on, but we don't know why. And oftentimes when I have spoken to students, right, time to degree is longer, debt level is longer because of responsibilities outside of school, right? It's not school that's the issue, but other factors that are playing into that. And oftentimes I think it's ignored. And you are starting to see a bit more institutions considering like wraparound support for students in that capacity. But I think it would be supported and done more if there were a bit more qualitative research to understand the why in those two areas.
Fantastic. Well, it doesn't seem possible, but this is kind of the end of the class. I can't tell you how much we've valued being with you and learned from you. That these were fantastic presentations. To be able to deal with the complexity of data and learn with the tools and deal with everything else that you had going on in your lives, it was amazing. As you know, this is part of a three cohorts of faculty who are going through this. We're very much hoping you'll pick this up and develop the training in your own institutions. Deshawn, maybe you have a couple of words to say about that, and Deborah about the kind of the next steps. But from a personal point, and I think from the team point of view, we've learned so much and really enjoyed it. We're kind of sad it's over. But Deshawn, you want to kind of close out? Deborah?
Sure. Deborah, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to say. I can let you go first. Mine is pretty short and brief.
Not one to miss an opportunity, although I don't have any further remarks, but this work and the time you've taken is significant and is core to what we need in the field. For the work that Excelencia does, the ability to push at a policy level, which is about scale, grounded in institutional effort, requires that we invest in and support the faculty and the minds such as yours that can tell us what we need to know to be better advocates and to support your efforts. So thank you for taking the extra time to do that and educating. Our commitment is to find ways to create venues for this information to get out in a timely manner. So we're not solving for false positives and the things we think we know, but informed by the things we know are making a difference. So this was not just an esoteric exercise. I do think it has weight and meaning and the kind of work that shows what's possible. And we have to keep on disaggregating our data to see where the strengths and opportunities are for our students. So thank you all for continuing to show that. And then I say, keep pushing, because you've just scratched the surface of what is possible, being able to tell these stories. I've been looking at this for a long time, and still getting the stories out is not as, doesn't have the audience it does now. And this is the time to seize that. So thank you all for that. I leave to Deshaun to go into the semantics and the technical part of it. Take it forward.
Sure. Just a few things. I first would like to thank the Coleridge Initiative and Excelencia for all of the hard work that they've done behind the scenes. It is a lot of moving pieces, and this would not be possible without their work, their input, and their help. Secondly, and probably first, I would like to thank you, which is the faculty of all the institutions that are represented here. I know that there's so many other things you could be doing. I know and understand that we are still in the middle of a pandemic. And I also have sat through this class, so I know how it can be time consuming. I know how it is to sit on Zoom for 2 hours straight, and just all of the above, right? So the fact that you are here, the fact that we've made it through this far, I would like to thank you all for that. Two quick things, and then I'm actually done. One, I have been in contact with, I believe, just about everyone concerning the contract. Most I have your contracts. If I don't, we've been in conversation. The moment I get them out, I have already instructed our operations team to release those funds to your institutions. So I am working on that day and night. I do not want you to think that that is on the back burner, but something I'm trying to get done for you all, because I know how important that is. Last but not least, I know I've kind of sent out reminders to the HBCUs, and I know Excelencia mentioned this with the HSIs when they met yesterday, but I'm putting the Survey Monkey back in the chat. If you have not, please take it. We take your feedback seriously. We want to make sure that we can pivot wherever we need to pivot and make any adjustments in the next training that we possibly can. I understand that this is kind of new for us all, and Gates has even allowed us, right, to make some changes where we best see fit. So by you completing that survey will be extremely helpful. It's also important to note that the next training, we actually intend to spend at least 2, possibly 3 days at NSF, which would mean that one of those modules that typically takes a week for you to go through will happen in the span of those 2 to 3 days. But we will hopefully be at NSF, which will cut down on the time, but also allow you the opportunity to engage with NSF and their officers.
We will need to get that cleared first, obviously, but
yes,
that's in the
but
works.
we're working, but we're all working on it. We have been in some conversation, so it looks promising, but of course there are things that might be out of our control, but hopefully we will be with NSF during the next training in the early part of 2022. And that was all the announcements that I had. So once again, thank you all for your time and your support and efforts.
Okay, well, on behalf of all of us, this has been a privilege to work with you guys. Thank you so very much. Take care of yourselves. We're going to miss you. Don't be strangers. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.